This might be the most important gem of this episode is probably this issue. I think what no one wants to talk about is that sex and sexual desirability and self-esteem are really all, and even like happiness in life are all pretty intimately wound up, and people do not want to admit that if you're sexually desirable, man or woman, that's pretty important to human psychology.
Warning, this podcast is for entertainment only and not intended for medical purposes.
Enter the Freud.
And if you're really not sexually desirable, that is hard on your self-esteem, and that's hard on your mental health. And I think that's a fact that people don't want to acknowledge.
Why do you think they don't want to acknowledge that?
But in some ways, if we look at those definitions of those words very literally, it is superficial, it is objectifying, because it's like physical, particularly for women, it's like physical attributes make a person, not exclusively of course, but significantly physically attributes determine whether a person's sexually desirable or not. So in a certain way it is, quote, superficial, and it is, quote, objectifying, in that it's a very physical appearance-based criteria for desirability. And if I'm right, that's an important part of self-esteem and an important part of feeling appreciated by the world, and thus a crucial thing for mental health.
Well, okay, so if you're able to say this so clearly and emphatically, like, why wouldn't this be something that everyone just accepts at face value? What is this weird deception? Where does this come from? If this is so obviously everyone's issue, why wouldn't, what kind of miraculous hypnotism has happened?
Yeah, that's the really interesting question, because it's not obvious. Because honestly, you and I are saying this thing that sort of seems obvious, but dude, I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say this in my fucking nearly 50-year life. That like being sexually desirable is a very important part of self-esteem and thus mental health. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that, because it's a taboo thing to say.
Dear God, why? Why would it be? Why?
That's the million-dollar question.
Like, what? It's okay. So if it's taboo to say, then it's just like, I mean, this something very strange has happened a long time ago, and so like. And is crept in to the port, almost to the point where, let's go back to Freud in the Victorian era, when once upon a time to even speak of a penis or to think of a penis would cause you psychiatric distress, right? And so,
yes, dude, that's part of the story for sure. For
sure, right? Like as we look at this, and here we are today, and clearly everyone can talk about, you know, fucking and cocks and pussies, and like everyone can talk about that, right? But and without getting a fucking full on aneurysm or getting some phantom blindness or a paralysis, which used to happen in the Victorian era, right?
Yeah.
And so instead, what we're getting is just like a massive dump of anxiety, depression. Everyone needs medication, which that's a different story. Or let's just get real. Like, there's just a bunch of suicides, and so we have to acknowledge that something went very, very askew. And then as we know something happened to lead us to this place, to where no one is willing to acknowledge, in the same way that in the Victorian era, no one was willing to acknowledge that, hey, you guys, we have some really messed up views on sexuality.
Yeah, I think I think the analogy of the Victorian era is very good. The Victorian era, they had to completely deny sex existed at all, whereas now we just want to deny that it's like important, or that it's like we're the Victorian era kind of was doing a cultural and religious sexual denial, whereas now we're kind of doing almost like a political, righteous, feminist sexual denial or something.
What is that? A political, feminist sexual denial? Like, really?
Yeah.
Let's try to...
Well, okay, so I do think you were. It was apt to look at the Victorian era, because I think the roots of it probably are like Christianity. Actually, I think a big part of it is what I was referencing earlier, that there's a really ugly history of mating way back in time.
That's important. That's important. I hate that everyone says, they just put in the placeholder of Christianity. I
think Christianity was your reaction to this other stuff. I've been referencing it. Let me just try to give a super brief summary of it. But I highly recommend everyone YouTube search Mads Larson and watch his stuff. It's shocking. But, okay, so for hundreds of thousands of years, there's a few different chapters and it's complicated. But basically, sex and mating was mostly like tribes taking over other tribes, killing all the men, and raping all the women. And the men who were in power got to have the most sex, and the men who weren't in power didn't. And it just was this like brutal fight. It was almost like sex was like a resource like gold that was just treated as a physical resource that you could just steal. And that was like most of human history, was a really brutal story around sex. And women's consent was irrelevant for 99% of the history of the human race. And then I think Christianity emerged as trying to deal with that and trying to civilize it. And so Christianity came with all these rules around sex to try to civilize it and try to like have it be healthier and safer for women and have it work within the fabric of culture. And I think it was very successful. I think Christianity and probably other world religions moved sex out of this brutal, hellish thing into a more civilized, safe thing. But it also had its problems that we're dealing with now. And I think part of it is a lot of people now don't think of themselves as still constrained by or influenced by Christian sexual assumptions. But I think they still are, but now they're under the guise of feminism or woke whatever or all this stuff. But really, I think it probably goes back to sex is bad, and there's no way my mental health or self-esteem is related to sex, because sex is primitive and it's bad, and I'm above that.
Okay, so I think I just understood that you are perceiving that there's some kind of an individual, like a psychic split that each person must have to maintain a persona in our world today. And tell me if I'm tracking you right. I'm just taking it a bit further, right?
I think so, yeah.
Right. So to do this to where you would say, okay, yeah, sex is just this thing I'm going to put over here. It's not related to this persona. The rest of the way that I walk around the world presenting myself, right? It's not actually part of that. I don't walk around as a sexual being. I don't interact with I don't interact publicly as a sexual being, right?
No.
Unless, I mean, dear God, like sometimes I see people and they're so freakishly sexy going through the world. It's like they are definitely embracing this, right? Mm-hmm. But I don't know if if the general populace knows what to do with those. The select few.
Well, I think the general populace views those people as superficial and stupid and misguided. And I think it sort of is tricky, because there are people who take the sexual desirability too far, and that seems to be an imbalanced sign of mental illness or whatever, right?
What? No. What do you mean? What do you mean?
Like imagine a person who, those people who get all these body modifications because they want to look like the real Barbie doll or something, or whatever.
Or the Giga. You mean the Giga Chad? They get their jaw restructured.
Yeah, just taking body modification and plastic surgery to crazy heights. So that's an obvious example. But a less obvious example, but still probably in the same category, is people who spend way too much time at the gym, way too much time grooming their hair, way too much time getting their clothes right, blah, blah, blah. Like that, there is some mental illness in that, right?
But,
and most people can see that, and we can say that on our podcast, and no one's going to care. But if we say the opposite, that people who don't attend to their sexual desirability, they have mental illness too, that is not an okay thing to say.
nice distinction. Yeah, I think you've really just put a pin in this one. And now, since we can see that this came from some kind of a misguided message, and it exists almost subconsciously for each individual plus the society as a totality. And then when I look at like, okay, here we are today, let's just extend this into the future, right? Because this misguided situation has then led to young men being outraged at women across the board. And so then what do you think the next phenomenon will be? Like just based on...
Well, if we're optimistic, which I'm not optimistic in the short term, but if we're optimistic, it would be people realizing what we're saying and then coming to realize, oh, sexual desirability is important. Let's learn how to integrate that in a healthy way.
Fantastic. Yes. And if it doesn't, like if somehow this isn't a trend of slowly waking up and becoming accepting, expanding, like what is the alternative? Like the alternative, I look at some cultures that still exist that have almost regressed into women are property, women are, and this once again goes out to the fringe of where these incels would like to go, is just like women are property, they have to have sex with us, it's their job, it's not our fault that we're genetically defective, right? Like that kind of a but once again, there's no way that will happen. There's no way. There are too many people that are awake to what we are saying, but it's right under our noses. And I guess this now makes me think about like now that we're talking about mental health and young men being angry at women, I'm like, well, being a young dude just generally angry at women is not healthy. I would have to say that this is not a healthy position that our boys are inheriting.
Absolutely. It's sort of inevitable if so much of the culture in education is doing this. It's sort of inevitable. I do want to quickly say, insert in here, because I don't want to forget to say this, is I sort of see a relatively quick and easy fix to this problem.
Wow.
And that is that I'm going to be scientifically controversial here and say all boys have dads. Okay? That's my
true.
Controversial scientific statement. All
God.
boys have dads. And I would like to urge all dads to try to raise your sons well, to be concerned with your son's well-being. And one thing to do in that is correct what they're learning at schools.
Yeah.
And I think if a dad spends a little bit of time correcting it with the sons, I think problem solved. I think the dad can easily correct this thing in his son. I don't think it's that difficult. It's
a bit shocking that we're all in denial of something so fundamental right in your face. It's almost like if we were openly culturally denying that, like, to have money and to save is bad.
Yeah, totally.
It seems crazy.
It's totally.
It's actually crazier than that. If we had a culture where it was like, oh, never live for tomorrow, burn it all today, that would be easier to understand than this.
Totally. I agree.
Oh my God, am I overwhelmed in this moment. Like my head is spinning.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good because I think we've stumbled on a crux issue here.
All right, man, let's see what evolves over the next week and see if we can get after this again.